Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The house on the quiet street in Creve Coeur, Missouri, looked like 100 others in the neighborhood. Pale brick, a neat lawn, a 2-car garage, the kind of home young professionals buy when they believe their lives are just beginning. Inside that house, in the second week of November 2019, Jennifer Rothwell was carrying a secret so tender and so hopeful that she had not yet told most of the people who loved her. She was 6 weeks pregnant. She was 28 years old, a chemical engineer working for DuPont, a woman who had built her adult life around precision, patience, and problem solving. She had met her husband, Bo Rothwell, nearly a decade earlier, when they were both students studying chemical engineering at the University of Missouri in Columbia. They had been paired together in a laboratory, two young minds drawn to formulas and equations, and somewhere between the beakers and the late-night study sessions, something warmer had taken root. Jennifer admired his calm, deliberate way of thinking. He seemed serious about the future in a way that appealed to her own careful nature. Their shared ambitions, their shared language of science, became the foundation of a decade-long relationship that eventually became a marriage. By the fall of 2019, that marriage had settled into the outward rhythms of ordinary adult life. 2 engineers, 2 steady careers, a comfortable suburban home outside St. Louis. To neighbors and co-workers, the Rothwells looked like any young couple quietly building towards something. But marriages, like chemical compounds, can hold instability beneath a stable-looking surface, and this one did. Unknown to almost everyone around them, Bo had been carrying on an affair with another woman in the months before that November. He had been secretly weighing, in the coldest and most literal sense, the advantages and disadvantages of ending his marriage to Jennifer, going so far as to write out a list of pros and cons for leaving her. Jennifer, for her part, seemed to sense that something in her husband had changed. In the days before she vanished, she used her phone to search a phrase that what to do if your husband is upset you are pregnant. It was the search of a woman trying to understand a man who had become distant, trying to find the right words, trying to fix something before it broke. She did not yet know she was searching for a way to survive. On Tuesday, November 12th, 2019, Jennifer Rothwell did not show up for work. For a woman known for her reliability, for the discipline that came naturally to an engineer accountable to precise schedules and exacting standards, this was immediately wrong. Colleagues noticed. Someone made a call. And that same day, Bo Rothwell reported his wife missing, telling authorities she had last been seen leaving their home wearing business attire, dressed as though for an ordinary day at the office. At first, it read like the opening of countless missing person cases. A young professional vanishes without explanation. A husband anxiously alerts police. A community begins to worry. Search parties assembled. Bo Rothwell, remarkably, joined them. He walked alongside Jennifer's relatives and her co-workers, retracing possible paths, calling her name into wooded areas and empty lots, playing the part of the desperate husband searching for his missing wife. It was a performance that would later strike investigators, and eventually a jury, as one of the coldest details of the entire case. Because behind the scenes, the story police were piecing together did not match the one Bo was telling in public. Surveillance cameras had captured him the day before he reported Jennifer missing, on Monday, November 11th, buying bleach, carpet cleaner, and a pair of gloves. It was an unremarkable purchase on its own, the kind of errand run by any homeowner. But combined with what detectives found when they eventually searched the Rothwell home, it became the first hard thread in an unraveling story. Investigators discovered empty cleaning bottles inside the house, along with a carpet that was still wet, soaked through with bleach, and a section of flooring beneath it stained with what would later be confirmed as blood, Jennifer's blood, spread across a wide area. 2 days after Jennifer was reported missing, on November 14th, police arrested Bo Rothwell, not yet for murder, but for tampering with physical evidence. It was a charge that signaled investigators already suspected something in that house had been hidden, scrubbed, or destroyed. The very next day, before Jennifer's body had even been found, before anyone knew for certain what had happened to her, prosecutors escalated the case. Bo Rothwell was charged with second-degree murder. It was an extraordinary decision, built entirely on physical evidence and behavioral red flags rather than a recovered victim, and it signaled how convinced investigators already were that Jennifer Rothwell was no longer simply missing. She was gone. For nearly a week, Jennifer's family lived inside the unbearable space between hope and dread. They had watched her husband join search parties. They had heard him report her missing. And now they were told that same husband was behind bars, accused of causing her disappearance in the first place. It is difficult to imagine a more disorienting grief. To search for a missing loved one, while simultaneously learning that the person standing beside you in that search may be the reason she is gone. On November 18, 2019, 6 days after Jennifer vanished and 4 days after Bo's arrest, searchers found her body in a wooded area far from her own neighborhood, roughly 45 miles northwest of the home she had shared with her husband, in a rural stretch of Lincoln County, Missouri. Investigators later revealed that it was information from Bo himself that helped lead them to where she had been left. She had been abandoned among the trees, discarded the way one disposes of evidence rather than mourns a person, in a location chosen for its distance and its silence. The discovery transformed the case from an agonizing search into a formal homicide investigation, and it gave the community and Jennifer's grieving family the terrible clarity they had been both dreading and desperately needing. She had been severely beaten. She had been 6 weeks pregnant, and she had been carried far from home and left in the cold November woods by the man who had once studied beside her in a university laboratory, who had built a decade of shared life with her, who was, at that very moment, sitting in a jail cell on charges connected to her death. As investigators pieced together the physical evidence from the Rothwell home, the picture of that Monday night in November began to take grim shape. The blood found soaked into the carpet and its underlying padding was extensive, spread across a significant area, evidence not of a single quick moment, but of prolonged violence and desperate, hurried cleanup. The bleach, the carpet cleaner, the gloves purchased the evening before, all pointed toward a calculated effort to erase what had happened inside that house before anyone could see it. Detectives also uncovered something that struck at the emotional core of the case. Records showing that Bo Rothwell had been carrying on an affair with another woman in the months leading up to Jennifer's death, along with text messages exchanged between them, and a written list in which he appeared to weigh the pros and cons of leaving his wife. To prosecutors, this was not the profile of a man who snapped in a single unplanned moment of rage. It was the profile of someone who had been quietly, deliberately contemplating an exit from his marriage for weeks, perhaps months, before Jennifer's death, someone whose calm exterior masked calculation rather than confusion. And then there was Jennifer's own phone, the small glowing rectangle that had recorded, without her ever suspecting it would become evidence, the private fear that had been growing inside her in her final days. The search she had typed into it, "What to do if your husband is upset you are pregnant," became one of the most quietly devastating details revealed in court. It captured a woman trying to navigate a relationship she could feel shifting beneath her, a woman hoping for guidance, for reassurance, for some way to close the distance opening between her and the man she loved, entirely unaware that the distance was not something she could close with words or patience. She was doing what people do when a relationship feels troubled, searching for answers, hoping to fix it, hoping for a future that included the child she was carrying. She never got the chance. More than 2 years passed between Jennifer's death in November 2019 and the trial that would finally force her husband to answer publicly for what happened inside their home. In April 2022, a St. Louis County jury heard the case laid out by prosecutors, a case built on cleaning supplies purchased the night before a murder, blood soaked deep into carpet fibers, a mistress and a pros and cons list, and a search history that captured a pregnant woman's last private worry. Bo Rothwell did not deny killing his wife. He took the stand and offered his own account, one his defense hoped would soften the charge from murder to manslaughter. He testified that the two of them had a heated argument, one rooted in his affair with the other woman, and that in the heat of that argument, he struck Jennifer in the head from behind with a mallet. He said she stumbled toward the garage door, and that he hit her again. "I think I cracked her skull and she fell down the stairs," he told the court. "She was unresponsive. I couldn't tell if she was deceased." It was a chilling, almost clinical account, delivered by a man trained to describe processes and reactions with precision, now applying that same precision to describing the killing of his pregnant wife. But prosecutors argued forcefully that this was not a story of sudden, unplanned rage. They pointed to the affair carried on for months. They pointed to the list weighing whether to leave his marriage. They pointed to the fact that he had purchased bleach, carpet cleaner, and gloves the evening before he reported Jennifer missing, evidence, they said, of premeditation rather than panic. St. Louis County prosecuting attorney Wesley Bell later explained the office's position plainly. They had pursued the case as first-degree murder from the very beginning, and no lesser charge had ever been on the table as an acceptable outcome. After hours of deliberation on a Thursday evening in late April 2022, the jury returned its verdict. Bo Rothwell was found guilty of first-degree murder, tampering with physical evidence, and abandonment of a corpse. The jury had rejected his account of an unplanned, heat-of-the-moment killing, choosing instead to believe the story told by bleach bottles, wet carpet, secret texts, and a list of pros and cons. That Jennifer Rothwell's death had been the calculated end to a marriage her husband had already decided to leave behind, one way or another. On July 8, 2022, Bo Rothwell stood before a judge for sentencing. He apologized to Jennifer's family. He said he thought about her every single day. Whether those words offered any comfort to the people who had loved Jennifer, who had once watched her build a decade-long relationship with this same man, is something only they can say. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, Rothwell told the court he intended to appeal, a final procedural echo of a case that had already taken more than 2.5 years to reach this point. Prosecutor Wesley Bell, speaking after the sentencing, offered a simple, aching reminder of everything the case had truly cost. Jennifer Rothwell, he noted, would never have the chance to hold the child she had been carrying, the 6-week pregnancy that had briefly, quietly, filled her final days with hope even as her marriage was unraveling in ways she could not fully see. It is a detail that sits at the emotional center of this entire case. Not simply that a young engineer with a promising career was killed by the man she trusted most, but that she was killed while imagining a future that never arrived. A future that included searching her phone for the right words to hold her family together, when the person she was trying to reach had already, in his own mind, begun planning to leave. Jennifer Rothwell's story does not end with tidy justice or closure. It ends with a life sentence for the man responsible, a family left to carry grief that will never fully resolve, and a quiet, permanent absence where a daughter, a wife, a colleague, and a mother-to-be once stood. What remains is the memory of a woman who studied chemistry because she loved solving problems, who built a life on careful reasoning and hard work, and who spent her final days trying, in the most human way possible, to solve the one problem that had no safe answer. Story 2. Plainsboro, New Jersey is the kind of place people move to when they want quiet. Tree-lined streets, tidy apartment complexes, a sense that nothing too terrible could ever happen behind these doors. Carolyn Byington had built a life here that looked, from the outside, exactly like the life a bright, capable 26-year-old was supposed to have. She had graduated from Lafayette College, found steady work as a market research project manager at a marketing firm called Ambient Group in nearby Princeton, and settled into a modest apartment at the Hunter's Glen complex on Hunter Drive. She had a routine, a job she was good at, and co-workers who considered her dependable and well-liked. What she did not know, and what no one around her could have guessed, was that inside the walls of her own home, someone had already been watching her for weeks. June 10th, 2019 began like any other workday. Carolyn went into the Ambient Group offices at 902 Carnegie Center, greeted her colleagues, and moved through her tasks with the same steady competence she always brought to her job. Sometime around midday, she left the office and drove home, planning, it seems, to eat lunch at her apartment before returning for the rest of her shift, something she rarely did according to those who worked alongside her. It was an unremarkable decision, the kind of small deviation from routine that most people make without a second thought. For Carolyn, it would prove to be a fatal one. Neighbors at Hunter's Glen heard faint screaming coming from her apartment sometime that afternoon, along with what sounded like furniture being dragged or knocked over. At the time, none of them understood the significance of those sounds. By late afternoon, when Carolyn failed to return to the office and did not answer calls or messages, her co-workers grew worried. This was not like her. She was reliable, punctual, the sort of person whose absence registered immediately because it was so out of character. Concerned, they contacted the Plainsboro Police Department and asked for a wellness check at her apartment. Officers arrived at her home at approximately 5:57 in the evening. What they found inside would begin one of the most disturbing investigations Middlesex County had seen in years. Carolyn Byington was dead, her body bearing the marks of a violent and desperate struggle. She had suffered multiple stab wounds along with blunt force trauma. Injuries inflicted with whatever makeshift weapons had apparently been within reach in the moment, later identified as a screwdriver, a pair of scissors, and even a pen. There was no sign of a break-in, no shattered window or forced door to suggest a stranger had broken in off the street. Whoever had done this had gotten inside somehow, and had been there waiting when Carolyn walked through her own front door expecting nothing more than a quiet lunch. In the days and weeks that followed, investigators from the Plainsboro Police Department and the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office worked to reconstruct what had happened inside that apartment. They pieced together the timeline of Carolyn's final hours, interviewed her neighbors about the sounds they had heard, and began looking closely at the people in her life, co-workers, friends, anyone who might have had access to her apartment or a reason to want her dead. The absence of forced entry was the detail that gnawed at investigators most. If no one had broken in, then either Carolyn had let her killer inside willingly, or the killer had already found a way in long before that afternoon. The answer to that question would turn out to be far more unsettling than anyone initially imagined. As detectives worked through her circle of co-workers, one name kept surfacing: Kenneth Saul, a 30-year-old staff accountant who worked at the same office as Carolyn. The two had been employed together at Ambient Group since 2016, spending 3 years in the same workplace, seeing each other daily in the ordinary rhythm of office life. On paper, there was nothing that obviously connected him to violence. He was simply another employee, someone who processed numbers while Carolyn managed research projects a few desks away. But as investigators dug deeper into Saul's activities in the months before the murder, a far darker picture began to emerge, one that suggested Carolyn's death was not the result of a sudden, chance encounter, but the culmination of weeks of secret, calculated planning. It would take over 2 months of careful investigative work before police felt they had enough evidence to act. On August 21st, 2019, just after 10 o'clock in the evening, officers arrived at Kenneth Saul's residence in Lindenwold, New Jersey, and placed him under arrest. He was charged with first-degree murder and a weapons offense, and through his attorney, he entered a plea of not guilty, maintaining that he had not committed the crime. What investigators eventually uncovered was a story that seemed almost impossible to believe, the kind of thing that feels more suited to a crime thriller than to real life. According to the case built by prosecutors, and later confirmed through Saul's own admissions. His obsession with Carolyn had been building quietly for months before that terrible afternoon in June. In April 2019, while Carolyn was away at work, Saul had secretly made a copy of the key to her apartment. It was a small, almost unremarkable act of theft, the kind that leaves no obvious trace, and it gave him the ability to come and go from her private space whenever he pleased, without her ever suspecting a thing. Over the weeks that followed, Saul used that stolen key to enter Carolyn's apartment on multiple occasions while she was elsewhere, going about her day, entirely unaware that her home had been compromised. During these visits, he installed hidden surveillance cameras throughout her living space, quietly transforming her private sanctuary into something being watched and recorded without her knowledge or consent. It is difficult to fully capture the violation contained in that act. A place meant to be safe, meant to be entirely her own, had been turned into a stage for someone else's obsession, every private moment potentially exposed to eyes she never knew were watching. For weeks, this arrangement apparently continued undetected. Carolyn lived her normal life, going to work, coming home, existing inside the walls of an apartment that had secretly become something else entirely. Then on June 10, 2019, everything Saul had carefully hidden came dangerously close to being exposed. That day, in an unusual break from her normal routine, Carolyn came home during her lunch hour, something co-workers said she rarely did. She walked into her apartment and found Kenneth Saul there, in the middle of installing yet another hidden camera. What exactly passed between them in those first terrible moments can never be known with complete certainty, but the outcome was devastatingly clear. Confronted suddenly by the woman he had been secretly surveilling for months, Saul did not flee, did not attempt to explain himself away, and did not allow her the chance to simply call the police and report what she had found. Instead, according to his own later admission, a violent struggle broke out between them, one that ended with Carolyn Byington dead on the floor of the home that was supposed to be her refuge. The weapons used in the attack were not the kind a calculating killer would have brought with him in preparation for murder. A screwdriver, a pair of scissors, a pen. These were the ordinary, everyday objects a person might grab in a moment of chaos and panic, items that happened to be within reach as the confrontation spiraled into violence. It suggests that whatever Saul had originally intended when he walked into that apartment that day, murder may not have been the plan from the outset, but rather the desperate, monstrous escalation of a man determined not to be exposed. Whether he intended only to retrieve or adjust a camera, or whether his presence there was itself already crossing into something far more sinister, the confrontation ended with Carolyn fighting for her life against a co-worker she likely never suspected of harboring any threat toward her at all. After the struggle ended, Saul left the apartment and returned, remarkably, to work, as though the ordinary rhythm of the day could simply resume. Investigators later found that he had sent a text message to his supervisor that afternoon, explaining that he would be late getting back to the office because he was having work done on his car, a mundane, forgettable excuse offered in the immediate aftermath of an unthinkable act. It was this same ordinary camouflage, the ability to appear utterly unremarkable in the hours after taking a life, that had allowed Saul's obsession to grow undetected for so long in the first place. The path from Carolyn's death to Saul's arrest was not immediate, and the 2-month gap reflects the painstaking, methodical nature of the investigation that followed. Detectives from the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office, working alongside Plainsboro Police, gathered physical evidence from the crime scene, including DNA evidence reportedly found near Carolyn's body that would later be connected to Saul. They interviewed neighbors about the sounds they had heard on the day of the murder, spoke with co-workers about the relationships and dynamics within the office, and slowly began assembling a timeline that pointed towards Saul as the person responsible. When Saul was finally arrested in August 2019, he was formally indicted on a lengthy list of charges: first-degree murder, second-degree burglary, endangering an injured victim, hindering his own apprehension, possession of a weapon for an unlawful purpose, along with fourth-degree charges of stalking and tampering with evidence. Each charge told part of the larger story, not simply a single moment of violence, but a pattern of surveillance, invasion, and deception that had unfolded over months. At a detention hearing in early September 2019, a judge ruled that Saul would remain jailed without bail while awaiting trial, a decision reflecting the severity of the allegations against him. His attorney, Michael Roberts, told reporters that his client maintained his innocence and intended to fight the charges. For over 3 years, the case moved slowly through the New Jersey court system as both sides prepared for what was expected to be a lengthy and difficult trial. Saul's trial was originally scheduled to begin on December 5, 2022. But as that date approached, something extraordinary and deeply disturbing came to light. Something that revealed just how far Saul was willing to go to escape accountability for what he had done. In October 2022, the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office received a letter alleging that Saul, from inside his jail cell, was actively conspiring to commit a copycat murder. The plan, investigators uncovered, was almost unbelievable in its audacity. Saul had reportedly approached another inmate who was soon to be released from custody and offered him $15,000 to carry out a second, similar murder once he was free. The purpose of this copycat crime was to create the appearance that Carolyn's real killer was still out there, walking free, thereby casting doubt on Saul's own guilt and potentially unraveling the prosecution's case against him entirely. But the scheme apparently went even further and darker than a single-staged copycat killing. According to the investigation led by Detective Walter Kelly of the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office, Saul also conspired to have a witness in his own case killed, with the murder staged to look like a suicide, complete with a note in which the deceased witness would falsely claim responsibility for Carolyn's death. It was a plan built entirely on additional violence and deception, one manipulation layered atop another, all designed to protect a man who had already taken one innocent life from ever facing justice for it. Fortunately, the plot was discovered before it could be carried out, and Saul was charged with additional counts, including first-degree conspiracy to commit murder and second-degree conspiracy to tamper with a witness. Faced with the mounting weight of evidence against him, and with his attempted conspiracy now exposed and adding even more charges to an already devastating case, Kenneth Saul ultimately chose not to proceed to trial. On November 22, 2022, he stood before the court and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, second-degree burglary, and fourth-degree stalking in connection with Carolyn Byington's death, along with the additional conspiracy charges tied to his jailhouse scheme. In his plea, he admitted, in his own words, to copying Carolyn's key, planting the hidden cameras, and ultimately killing her during the confrontation that erupted when she caught him inside her home. On January 23, 2023, Saul returned to court in Middlesex County to face sentencing. Superior Court Judge Pedro Jimenez Jr. did not hold back in characterizing the nature of what Saul had done, describing the crime as senseless, cruel, and depraved. The judge sentenced Saul to 45 years in prison on the murder and burglary charges, and added a consecutive 10-year sentence for the conspiracy to commit murder and witness tampering plot he had orchestrated from behind bars, bringing his total sentence to 55 years. Under New Jersey's No Early Release Act, Saul is required to serve 85% of that sentence before he can even become eligible for parole, meaning he is likely to remain incarcerated for decades to come. Saul did not accept this outcome quietly. He pursued an appeal, arguing among other things that the search warrants used to gather evidence against him were improperly issued. But in December 2024, New Jersey's appellate court rejected his appeal in full, affirming that the warrants had been supported by probable cause, and that his sentence was appropriate given the severity of his crimes. Today, Kenneth Saul remains incarcerated at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, with his earliest possible parole eligibility not arriving until decades from now. The story of Carolyn Byington is, at its core, a story about the terrifying gap between how well we believe we know the people around us and how little we sometimes actually do. She worked alongside Kenneth Saul for 3 years, sharing an office, sharing routine daily interactions, with no apparent indication of the obsession quietly building beneath the surface of his ordinary behavior. There were no warning signs loud enough to be heard before it was too late, no obvious red flags that might have prompted her to change her locks or report a colleague's strange behavior. The violation of her home, the secret cameras hidden in the place she believed was entirely her own, represents a particular kind of horror. Not a stranger breaking down a door in a moment of chaos, but a slow, patient, calculated erosion of privacy and safety carried out by someone she likely greeted with a friendly hello each morning at work. Carolyn Byington was 26 years old when her life was taken from her. A young woman with a college degree, a promising career, and by every account from those who knew her, a life full of the kind of ordinary promise that so many young professionals carry with them. Her death, and the disturbing months of secret surveillance that preceded it, forced a quiet New Jersey community to confront an uncomfortable truth. That danger does not always arrive as a stranger in the dark, but sometimes wears a familiar face, sits a few desks away and waits, patiently and silently, for an opportunity that should never have come. Story 3. On the Gold Coast of Queensland, Australia, mornings begin gently. The air carries a mix of salt from the nearby beaches and the quiet hum of suburban life waking up, families making school lunches, cars pulling out of driveways, the ordinary rhythm of a place people often choose for its sense of safety and sunshine. It was into one of these ordinary mornings on September 8, 2015, that Tara Brown drove her small Mazda hatchback toward a child care center, her young daughter buckled into the back seat. She could not have known that this simple, loving errand, dropping her little girl off before the day properly began, would be the last act of tenderness she would ever complete. Within hours, the quiet streets of the suburb of Molendinar would become the scene of a horror that would shake all of Australia and expose, in the most devastating way possible, the deadly gaps that can exist between a woman's cry for help and a system meant to protect her. Tara Mattakino Brown was 24 years old, born in New Zealand and raised with the kind of warmth that made her, by every account from those who loved her, a devoted mother and a cherished daughter, sister, and friend. She had moved through life with the ordinary hopes most young women carry. A stable home, a happy child, a future that felt within reach. She had a young daughter she adored, a little girl who was, by all accounts, the center of Tara's world. Just a month before her death, Tara had taken a joyful family trip to Sydney with her daughter and her high school sweetheart, a small window into the kind of ordinary happiness she was still trying to build for herself and her child, even as darker forces circled closer in her life. That darker force had a name, Lionel Pater. The two had been in an on-and-off relationship since 2011, a relationship that had produced their daughter, but that had also, over the years, curdled into something dangerous. Pater was a former member of the Bandidos motorcycle gang, a man with a documented history of violence and criminal offending stretching back years before he ever crossed paths with Tara. Pater had breached protection orders meant to keep Tara safe on at least 3 separate occasions. He was, in the truest and most tragic sense, a known danger, a man whose pattern of behavior toward Tara had already been documented, already been flagged, already been the subject of formal legal intervention that had failed to hold. By the late summer of 2015, Tara had made the decision that so many survivors of domestic violence eventually make. She was trying to leave. She wanted out of the relationship, wanted safety and stability for herself and her daughter, away from a man whose presence in her life had become something to fear rather than something to build a future with. 8 days before her death, Tara walked into her local police station in a state of genuine fear. Pater had been sending her threatening text messages, and she wanted protection. This was not a woman acting on vague unease. This was a woman with direct, tangible evidence of threats being made against her, standing in front of the very institution designed to intervene in exactly this kind of situation. She was, in essence, asking the system to do the one thing it exists to do, to stand between a vulnerable person and a man who had already shown he was capable of violence. What happened next would later become the subject of intense scrutiny and a formal coronial investigation. A subsequent inquiry into Tara's death found that Gold Coast police had failed to properly investigate her domestic violence complaint and had failed to take out a domestic violence order on her behalf. Despite her desperate plea for help just days before Pater ran her off the road and beat her to death. The coronial findings would ultimately conclude that police officers involved in handling her case were disciplined for these failures, an official acknowledgement, delivered years too late, that the system meant to protect Tara Brown had let her down at the exact moment she needed it most. It is one of the most painful aspects of Tara's story. She did everything a victim of domestic violence is told to do. She reported the threats. She asked for legal protection. She reached out to the authorities in the days before her death, hoping that doing things the right way, the sanctioned way, would keep her safe. And somehow, through a combination of institutional failure and bureaucratic gaps, that request for help did not translate into the protection she so desperately needed. On the morning of September 8, 2015, after dropping her daughter off at childcare, Tara was driving through the streets of Molendinar when Lionel Pater, driving a Jeep, caught up with her. What followed was not a sudden, chaotic accident, but a deliberate, sustained act of aggression. Pater rammed his vehicle into the rear of Tara's small Mazda, forcing it off the road and down an embankment, where it flipped and came to rest, overturned, against the side of a nearby house. Tara was trapped inside the wreckage of her own car, injured and disoriented, but alive. In any version of this story where humanity prevailed, this would have been the moment the danger ended, the moment a driver responsible for a crash might stop to check on the person he had struck, or at the very least flee the scene. Instead, witnesses watched Pater bring his Jeep to a halt in the street and walk back toward the crash, not to help the woman trapped inside, but to finish what he had started. He retrieved a metal fire hydrant cover from the roadside, a heavy slab weighing roughly 7.8 kilograms, and used it to strike Tara repeatedly in the head as she remained trapped, unable to escape the wreckage of her overturned car. Neighbors, drawn outside by the sound of the crash, began calling for help, watching in horror as the assault continued in plain view on their own suburban street. Tara, trapped and bleeding, made a desperate emergency call, her final recorded words captured by the call taker who answered. "Please help me." It is a sentence that, once read, is almost impossible to forget, for words that capture the full weight of terror, helplessness, and the very last reserves of hope a person can summon in the worst moment of their life. The attack left Tara with catastrophic injuries, later documented as 6 skull and face fractures, wounds inflicted with such force that recovery was never truly possible. Pater, in the aftermath of the attack, turned violence on himself as well, sustaining self-inflicted stab wounds and a punctured lung before police arrived and took him into custody under guard. Tara was rushed to Gold Coast University Hospital, where doctors worked to save her, but the injuries to her brain were, in the language later used in court, non-survivable. She clung to life through the day and into the night. Her family gathered around her, forced to confront a reality no parent, no sibling, no loved one should ever have to face. Late that night, September 9, 2015, Tara's family made the unbearable decision to disconnect her life support, releasing her from the injuries that had already taken everything meaningful from her. She was 24 years old, a mother, a daughter, a woman who had spent her final days trying desperately to build a safer future, only to have that future stolen from her on an ordinary suburban street in broad daylight. Meanwhile, the couple's young daughter, the little girl Tara had dropped off at childcare that very morning, was placed into the care of family members, left to grow up without the mother who had loved her so deeply, and eventually to grow up needing to understand, in some form, what had happened to her family. Lionel Pater was charged with murder, and as investigators dug into his background, it became clear that Tara's killing was not an isolated act of sudden rage in a man with no history of violence. Pater was, at the time of his arrest, already facing an unrelated murder charge connected to the disappearance and death of a Gold Coast father named Greg Duffy, alongside a New Zealand man named Aaron John Crawford, both of whom had gone missing months earlier under circumstances that pointed toward Pater's involvement. The man who had murdered Tara Brown was, in other words, someone already suspected of taking other lives, a pattern of violence that stretched well beyond the relationship he had shared with her. In November 2015, Pater was formally committed to stand trial for Tara's murder following a hearing at the Southport Magistrates Court, an emotional proceeding attended by Tara's grieving friends and family, who sat in the courtroom facing the man accused of taking her from them. For over a year, the case moved through the Queensland legal system as prosecutors built their case and a trial date loomed, with Pater expected to face a full week-long trial contesting the charges against him. But on February 27, 2017, as the trial was set to begin in the Brisbane Supreme Court, with numerous family members and friends of Tara filling the courtroom, Lionel Pater abruptly changed course. Rather than proceeding through a full trial, he altered his plea and admitted guilt to the charge of murder. Justice Deborah Mullins of the Supreme Court sentenced him that same day to life imprisonment for the murder of Tara Brown. In the courtroom, Tara's mother stood and, in front of the man who had killed her daughter, condemned him publicly as a monster, giving voice to a grief and fury that had been building for over a year and a half since that terrible September morning. In the aftermath of his conviction, Pater reportedly wrote a letter intended for Tara's family, an attempt, on its surface, to address what he had done. But rather than offering the honest reckoning that might have brought some small measure of closure to a family still drowning in grief, the letter was later described by commentators as reprehensible in the way it continued to sidestep genuine responsibility, framing what had happened in vague terms rather than confronting directly the deliberate, sustained violence he had inflicted on a woman trapped and helpless in her own crashed car. It was a final, painful reminder that even after a guilty plea and a life sentence, true accountability, the kind that acknowledges the full human cost of what was done, remained frustratingly out of reach for the people who had loved Tara most. Tara's death did not end with Pater's sentencing, because she had gone to police just 8 days before her murder, specifically seeking protection from the man who would go on to kill her. Her case became the subject of a formal coronial investigation into whether authorities had done enough to protect her. The findings, released years later in early 2021, were damning. The coronial inquiry concluded that Gold Coast police had indeed failed to properly investigate her domestic violence complaint and had failed to secure a protection order on her behalf, despite the clear and documented threat Pater posed. Officers involved in the handling of her case faced disciplinary action as a direct result of these findings. This official acknowledgement transformed Tara Brown's story from a singular tragedy into something with broader, lasting significance for how domestic violence complaints are handled across Queensland and, by extension, across Australia. Her case became part of a larger, painful national conversation about the ways institutional systems can fail victims even when those victims do everything right, everything they are told to do, and still find themselves unprotected in the moment they need protection most. More than a decade removed from that September morning in Molendinar, Tara Brown's story continues to be told, not simply as a crime case to be recounted for shock value, but as a cautionary and deeply human account of what happens when warning signs are documented, reported, and still somehow allowed to go unaddressed. She was a mother who loved her daughter enough to drop her at childcare, even on what would become the last morning of her life. She was a woman brave enough to walk into a police station and ask, clearly and directly, for help against a man she knew to be dangerous. And she was, in her final moments, trapped and afraid, still able to summon the words, "Please help me." A plea that echoes far beyond that single roadside in Queensland, carrying with it a question that Tara's family, and countless advocates for domestic violence reform since, have continued to ask. What more needed to happen before the system finally listened? Her daughter grows up now in the care of family who love Tara fiercely and who carry, alongside their grief, the responsibility of keeping her memory alive, not as a headline or a statistic, but as a person. A young mother from New Zealand who built a life on the Gold Coast, who loved deeply, who tried to protect herself and her child the only way she knew how, and whose death forced an entire country to look honestly at the deadly cost of institutional failure in the face of domestic violence. Story 4. The call came in just after midnight, the kind of call that dispatchers learn to brace for the moment the caller's voice cracks before a single word is spoken. It was the early hours of May 4th, 2010, in the quiet, tree-lined suburb of Oviedo, Florida, a town where manicured lawns and cul-de-sacs suggested nothing more dramatic than a barking dog or a stolen bicycle. But on this night, the phone lines carried something far darker. A woman's voice, shaking and breathless, told the 911 operator that she believed she had just killed a man. That man was her estranged husband, Robert Klein, and the woman on the phone was Anita Jane Smithy. For the responding officers who arrived at the modest home minutes later, the scene that greeted them looked less like an ordinary domestic dispute and more like the aftermath of a battle. Robert Klein lay in the bedroom, struck by 2 bullets from a .38 caliber pistol, his life already slipping away before paramedics could do anything meaningful to save him. Anita herself bore visible wounds, cuts, and a stab injury to her abdomen, and in that first chaotic exchange with police she said her husband had done this to her, that he had come at her with a knife during a violent assault, and that she had fired the gun only because she feared for her life. It was the kind of story that, if true, painted a woman driven to the most desperate act imaginable in defense of her own survival. But as investigators began peeling back the layers of that night, the story would prove to be far more complicated than a simple tale of victim and aggressor. To understand what happened in that bedroom, it helps to understand who Anita and Robert were to each other before the gunshots. They were husband and wife, though by May 2010 their marriage existed in that painful limbo so many troubled relationships pass through, technically still bound by law but living apart, separated in every practical sense except the paperwork. Robert Klein was 41 years old, a man whose life, like so many entangled and doomed relationships, had become a tangled knot of resentment, longing, and unresolved conflict with the woman he had once promised to spend his life with. Despite the separation, the two had not fully let go of one another. They continued to see each other, continued to talk, and continued a physical relationship even as their marriage crumbled around them. It is a detail that complicates any easy narrative, because it means the two people at the center of this tragedy were neither strangers nor simple enemies. They were bound by history, by whatever love or obligation had once brought them together, and by the messy gravitational pull that keeps some couples orbiting each other long after they should have drifted apart. On the night in question, by Anita's own account, she had asked Robert not to come to her home. He came anyway. It was a small detail, but one that would echo through years of legal proceedings, because it spoke to a pattern, a man who did not respect boundaries, who inserted himself into his estranged wife's life on his own terms rather than hers. When he arrived, the two shared drinks, and according to Anita's testimony, they had consensual physical relation. For a moment, perhaps, there was an illusion of intimacy restored, a flicker of what their marriage once was. But that illusion, if it existed at all, shattered violently in the hours that followed. Anita would later tell police, and eventually a jury, that after the two had been intimate, Robert wanted to continue, and she did not. What happened next, according to her account, escalated with terrifying speed. She said Robert became enraged, accusing her of being unfaithful, of sleeping with someone else during their separation, and that his anger turned physical. She claimed he assaulted her while simultaneously stabbing and beating her, a horrifying combination of violence that left her fighting for her life in her own bedroom. In that moment of sheer terror, she said, she reached for a .38 caliber pistol kept near her bed and fired twice, striking the man who had once been her husband and who was now, in her telling, trying to kill her. It is the kind of account that, standing alone, evokes deep sympathy. A woman assaulted in her own home, fighting back against a man twice betraying her trust, first through infidelity accusations and then through violence. She called 911 afterward, her voice full of panic, telling the operator she thought she had killed him. In that first call, she said Robert had stabbed her. It seemed, on the surface, to be a textbook case of self-defense. A woman standing her ground against a violent attacker exactly as Florida's self-defense laws were designed to protect. But investigators are trained to look past the surface, and what they found beneath it would unravel Anita's story thread by thread. As detectives processed the scene and began piecing together forensic evidence, inconsistencies started to emerge. The wounds on Anita's body, while real, did not entirely match the narrative she had first given. During subsequent questioning, after she had already invoked her right to remain silent, Anita made an admission that would become the single most damaging piece of evidence in the entire case. She told investigators that she had inflicted some of her own wounds, stabbing herself in the stomach because she feared that without visible injuries, no one would believe her claim of self-defense. It is a chilling admission to sit with. Imagine a woman, in the immediate aftermath of shooting the father of her children, taking a knife to her own body, not out of confusion or shock, but with the calculated goal of manufacturing evidence to support a story. Prosecutors would later seize on this detail as proof that Anita's entire self-defense claim was a fabrication built on the fly, a desperate attempt to reframe a killing born of rage or resentment as an act of survival. They argued that Smithy had shot her husband not because he was adulating her, but because he simply would not leave her home when she wanted him gone, and that the anger of that refusal, layered atop a bitter, protracted separation, had exploded into deadly violence. The prosecution painted a picture of a relationship darker and more complicated than simple domestic violence. They suggested the couple had, at times, engaged in what was described in court as consensual, and that what happened on the night of the shooting was, in their view, an extension of that dynamic gone wrong, not a sudden, unprovoked physical assault. It was a deeply uncomfortable argument to make in a courtroom, one that forced jurors to wade through the murkiest waters of intimate relationships, trying to discern truth from a night that only two people had witnessed, and one of them was dead. Anita's defense team countered that the self-inflicted wound did not erase the reality of what Robert had done to her that night. They argued that trauma responses are not always rational, that a woman who has just survived a violent assault might act in ways that seem strange or damaging to her own credibility, not because she is lying about the assault, but because fear and panic do not follow a neat, believable script. They pointed to her injuries as consistent, at least in part, with a physical struggle, and reminded jurors that self-defense claims do not require a victim to behave perfectly in the immediate aftermath of trauma. What followed the shooting was not a swift resolution, but an agonizing stretch of legal limbo. Anita Smithy was arrested and charged with second-degree murder in the death of Robert Klein in 2010. When prosecutors offered her a chance to plead guilty, she refused, insisting that she had acted only to save her own life. That refusal set the stage for a trial that would not actually begin for 4 long years, a gap during which the case sat, unresolved, a wound that never had the chance to heal for either family involved. For years is an eternity when a person's freedom and a family's grief hang in the balance. Robert Klein's relatives lived those years without closure, without a verdict to tell them whether the man they loved had died a victim of violent crime or as the aggressor in his own tragic ending. Anita, too, lived under the crushing weight of an unresolved charge, her future suspended, unable to move forward, unable to fully grieve or explain, caught in the machinery of a justice system that moves at its own indifferent pace. When the trial finally began in November 2014 in Sanford, Florida, it became a spectacle that drew significant media attention. Prosecutors and defense attorneys presented dramatically different portraits of the same two people and the same fatal night. Witnesses took the stand. Forensic experts debated the meaning of wound patterns. The jury listened to the 911 call, Anita's panicked voice replaying the horror of that night for a room full of strangers tasked with deciding her fate. On November 20th, 2014, after deliberating for less than 3 hours, the jury returned its verdict. They found Anita Jane Smithy guilty of second-degree murder. It was a swift decision for a case with such emotional and legal complexity, suggesting that whatever doubts the defense had raised, the jury found the prosecution's narrative, the self-inflicted wound, the inconsistencies in her account, the absence of evidence that she tried to flee, more convincing than her claim of self-defense. The moment the verdict was read, Anita's composure broke entirely. Courtroom cameras captured her collapsing into the arms of her attorney, sobbing as the reality of the conviction settled over her. It was a raw, unscripted moment of human devastation. A woman who moments earlier had still held on to hope, now facing the collapse of the life she had known. 3 months later, on February 2nd, 2015, judge announced Anita's sentence, 40 years in prison. For a woman who maintained she had only been fighting to survive, it was a sentence that effectively meant spending the majority of her remaining adult life behind bars. She had faced the possibility of a life sentence, and 40 years, while less than the maximum, still represented the near total loss of her freedom. For most cases, this might have been the end of the story, a conviction, a sentence, a slow fade from public memory. But Anita Smithy's legal team did not stop fighting. They appealed the conviction, arguing that the mistakes made by her original defense attorneys during the 2015 trial had deprived her of a fair chance to present her case. Specifically, they pointed to a critical strategic error. Her defense team had introduced the 911 call and certain expert testimony during the trial, a decision that inadvertently opened the door for prosecutors to introduce her previously suppressed confession about the self-inflicted stab wound, evidence that should never have reached the jury's ears in the first place. It took years for the appellate process to run its course, but on December 31st, 2020, 10 years after the shooting and 6 years after her conviction, the 5th District Court of Appeal issued its ruling. In a narrow 2-1 decision, the appellate judges reversed the lower court's denial of Smithy's motion, agreeing that ineffective assistance of counsel had indeed deprived her of a fair trial. Her conviction was overturned, and the case was sent back to the lower courts for an entirely new trial. It was a stunning turn of events, the kind of legal reversal that offers a rare second chance to someone who had already spent years believing her fate was sealed. For Robert Klein's family, however, it meant reopening a wound they had believed was finally closing, facing the prospect of relitigating the most painful chapter of their lives all over again, a decade after his death. As both sides prepared for a second trial, a different kind of resolution took shape, not through the drama of a courtroom verdict, but through negotiation. In May 2021, Anita Smithy entered a plea of no contest to a charge of second-degree murder, reclassified under Florida law. A no contest plea is a peculiar legal instrument. It is not an admission of guilt, but it carries the same practical consequences as one, allowing a defendant to accept a sentence without formally conceding that the prosecution's version of events was true. Under the terms of the agreement, Judge Marlene Alva sentenced Anita to time already served, approximately 2,369 days, or about 6.5 years. She was also placed on 10 years of probation and ordered to pay significant financial restitution, including thousands of dollars to cover the costs of the police investigation and prosecution, along with a substantial payment to Florida's Crimes Compensation Trust Fund, a fund designed to support victims of violent crime, in this case honoring the memory of the man she had killed. In total, her financial obligations from the plea deal exceeded $40,000. The agreement carried one more sobering condition. Should she ever violate the terms of her probation, a mandatory minimum sentence of 25 years could still be imposed upon her. Reports at the time suggested that the plea deal was one that both the prosecution and Robert Klein's own family ultimately agreed to, a recognition that dragging both families through the trauma of another full trial, a decade after the original tragedy, might serve no one's healing. It was not a clean, satisfying resolution in the way a dramatic acquittal or a decisive second conviction might have been. It was instead the kind of compromise that real life so often demands, imperfect, incomplete, but final. Anita Smithy walked out of custody in 2021 a free woman, though far from an unburdened one. She remains under the shadow of that hanging 25-year sentence, a sword that will fall only if she stumbles during her probation. She has settled in Claremont, Florida, and found work as a data entry specialist, a quiet, ordinary occupation for a woman whose name had once dominated Florida court dockets and national television. Her case has since drawn renewed attention, each retelling forcing audiences to sit once more with the same unanswerable question that haunted the original jury. Was Anita Smithy a victim who fought back against a violent attacker, or a woman who killed her estranged husband and then tried desperately, tragically, to rewrite the story of that night? The physical evidence, the self-inflicted wound, the years of appeals, the eventual plea, none of it offers a perfectly clean answer. In the end, is a story about the impossibility of ever fully knowing what happens behind closed doors between two people bound by a broken marriage. Robert Klein died in a bedroom in Oviedo, Florida, on a night that began, by all accounts, with something resembling reconciliation and ended in gunfire. Anita Smithy survived that night only to spend the next decade fighting to prove that survival was the truth, not a story she constructed to escape consequence. Somewhere between those two realities lies whatever actually happened, a truth that perhaps only Anita herself, and the man who can no longer speak, will ever fully know. Story 5. There are places in America where the past never quite settles, where a single terrible summer becomes the dividing line between one version of a town and another. Gainesville, Florida, in the last days of August 1990, was one such place. Before that week, it was a college town known for palm trees, orange groves, and the roar of the University of Florida Gators on a Saturday afternoon. After that week, it would be remembered forever by a name that still makes people flinch, the Gainesville Ripper. Behind that name was a man named Daniel Harold Rowling, and the story of how he came to earn it, and how the authorities finally caught up with him, is one of the darkest chapters in modern American crime. Shreveport, Louisiana, where Daniel Harold Rowling was born on May 26, 1954. He was one of two sons in a household ruled by his father, James Harold Rowling, a Korean War veteran and a Shreveport police officer, a man whose authority at home was absolute and whose temper was merciless. The father Danny grew up with was not simply strict. He was cruel in ways that left deep, permanent scars. He beat his wife and sons for the smallest, most trivial offenses, sometimes for nothing more than breathing in a manner that irritated him. He told his son outright that he had never been wanted, that his birth had been an unwelcome burden from the very beginning. The house on the edges of Shreveport held painful stories, the kind of stories that make a reader wish they were fiction. Danny's mother, Claudia, tried more than once to escape the marriage, fleeing with her sons, only to return again and again, trapped by fear, by finances, by the thousand invisible chains that bind people to abusive relationships. In one incident that lodged itself permanently in family memory, James pinned his own son to the ground, handcuffed him, and had police haul the boy away simply because his presence embarrassed him. In another, young Danny watched his father beat a family dog so severely that the animal died in his arms. It is impossible to read these details without feeling a chill, not because they excuse what would come later, but because they offer the faintest, most disturbing outline of how a child raised entirely without safety or love might grow into a man capable of unthinkable violence. By his teenage years, Danny was already brushing against the edge of the law, arrested for robberies in Georgia and Alabama, once caught peering through a window at a woman as she undressed. As an adult, he drifted from job to job, unable to hold anything steady, working for a time as a waiter at a Poncho's restaurant in Bossier City, Louisiana, but never finding an anchor. Something inside him remained unsettled, restless, and increasingly dangerous, though no one around him yet understood exactly how dangerous he had become. In November 1989, nearly a year before the events that would make his name infamous, a horror unfolded inside a home in Shreveport that police would not connect to Danny Rolling until much later. William Grissom, 55 years old, his daughter Julie, 24, and his 8-year-old grandson Sean were attacked in their own home while preparing dinner together. An ordinary family evening turned into a massacre. All three were killed, and Julie Grissom's body was mutilated, cleaned, and deliberately posed afterward, a detail that investigators would later realize carried a chilling signature, the mark of someone who did not simply kill, but who staged his violence with disturbing intention. At the time, the case went unsolved, filed away as one more tragedy without an answer. No one in Shreveport yet knew that the man responsible would soon travel south into Florida, carrying whatever broken machinery lived inside him, and unleash it on a college town that had no idea what was coming. The nightmare in Gainesville began in the early hours of August 24, 1990. Rolling broke into an apartment shared by two university freshmen, 18-year-old Sonia Larson and 17-year-old Christina Powell, two young women who, like thousands of others that week, were simply starting a new chapter of their lives at the University of Florida. What happened inside that apartment was an act of calculated brutality. Larson was killed upstairs while she slept, and Powell was murdered downstairs after being bound and assaulted. Rolling then staged the scene before leaving, an act so disturbing in its deliberateness that it left investigators struggling to comprehend the mind behind it. The following night, August 25th, he struck again. Krista Hoyt, an 18-year-old honors chemistry student at Santa Fe College, returned home from playing racquetball, unaware that a stranger had already broken into her apartment and was waiting inside. What followed was a killing marked by such calculated cruelty that even seasoned homicide detectives who arrived at the scene were visibly shaken, some later describing it as among the worst crime scenes they had ever encountered in their careers. 2 days later, on August 27th, Rolling claimed his final two victims in Gainesville. Tracy Poles, 23, and her roommate Manny Tabawada, also 23, were attacked in their shared apartment. Tabawada, larger and stronger than the previous victims, fought back, forcing Rolling into a violent physical struggle before he was overpowered. Poles, hearing the commotion, tried desperately to barricade herself inside her bedroom, but the door gave way. In an unsettling detail that would later draw investigators' attention, every victim except Tabawada shared a striking physical resemblance. Petite, brunette, brown-eyed young women, uncomfortably similar in appearance to Rolling's own mother, a detail that would haunt discussions of his psychology for years afterward. By the time the fifth body was discovered, Gainesville had transformed into a city gripped by pure terror. This was no ordinary crime wave. Students changed their daily routines entirely, moved in groups, slept multiple to a room out of sheer fear of being alone. Some packed up and withdrew from the university altogether, unable to bear staying in a town where a killer walked free among them. Sales of deadbolt locks, pepper spray, and firearms spiked overnight. Parents drove hundreds of miles to pull their children out of dormitories. For 4 days, an entire community had been forced to confront the reality that safety itself, the most basic assumption of daily life, was an illusion that could shatter in an instant. In the frantic search for the killer, investigators initially focused on a young man named Edward Lewis Humphrey, a 20-year-old University of Florida student with a documented history of mental illness who had previously been convicted of assaulting his grandmother. Humphrey's photograph appeared repeatedly across news broadcasts and newspaper front pages, his face becoming, for a terrifying stretch of months, the face of the Gainesville Ripper in the public imagination. He was held in custody for 5 months while investigators built their case, only for a grand jury to ultimately decline to indict him, citing insufficient evidence connecting him to the murders. It is worth pausing on this detail because it represents one of the quieter tragedies embedded within this larger horror story. Humphrey was innocent. He spent 5 months of his young life under suspicion for crimes he did not commit, his reputation and mental health already fragile, now further strained by public accusation. After Rowling's eventual arrest, authorities publicly cleared Humphrey of all charges. He went on, remarkably, to rebuild his life, graduating from a local college in 1994 and later earning a degree magna cum laude from the University of Central Florida in 2000, a small testament to resilience amid a story otherwise defined by loss. While Gainesville searched for its killer, fate was already assembling the pieces that would eventually expose him. Investigators in Louisiana had alerted Florida authorities to the unsolved Shreveport murders of the Grissom family, and a Florida Department of Law Enforcement investigator named Don Maines traveled to Shreveport in November 1990 to compare notes. What he found sent a jolt through the investigation. The posing of victims, the residue of tape on their bodies, even the use of vinegar to cleanse the crime scenes, all bore an eerie, unmistakable similarity to what had happened in Gainesville. When forensic testing revealed that both perpetrators shared the same rare blood type, Maines called it nothing short of a revelation. But it was an ordinary woman named Cindy Jurisic who ultimately broke the case wide open. Jurisic had known Danny Rowling personally, having met him at her hometown church in Louisiana. In August 1990, as she drove through the Florida Panhandle, she heard a radio report about the string of murders unfolding in Gainesville, and something inside her recoiled with recognition. She remembered disturbing conversations Rowling had once had with her and her then-husband, remembered her husband telling her, with visible unease, that Rowling had confided he liked to stick knives into people. She remembered, too, an unsettling comment Rowling had made about wanting to leave for a place where the girls were beautiful, where he could simply lie in the sun and watch them. For months, Jurisic tried to push the thought away, unwilling to believe someone she knew could be capable of such horror. But the feeling would not leave her alone. In November 1990, she finally picked up the phone and called Crime Stoppers, telling them plainly that there was one man they needed to investigate, Danny Rowling. It was an act of quiet, almost unbearable courage, the kind of decision that requires a person to trust their instincts even when every social impulse urges silence. Investigators moved quickly on the tip. It turned out Rowling was already sitting in the Marion County Jail, arrested weeks earlier, on September 7, 1990, for robbing an Ocala supermarket, a robbery committed only 10 days after the bodies of the final 2 Gainesville victims had been discovered. He had been hiding in plain sight the entire time, held on an unrelated charge while the largest manhunt in the region's history searched desperately for a man they did not realize they already had in custody. Once detectives confirmed that Rowling's blood type matched the evidence from both the Gainesville and Shreveport crime scenes, the investigation accelerated. They discovered he had a history of armed robbery convictions and connected him to a bank robbery that had occurred on the very day Krista Hoyt's body was found. Returning to evidence lockers, they matched tools recovered from his belongings to marks left at the murder scenes. Perhaps most chilling of all, they found a small wooded campsite where Rowling had been living near the apartment complexes he had stalked, and within it, audio diaries he had recorded, tapes on which he seemed to allude, in his own voice, to the crimes he had committed. Rowling was formally charged with 5 counts of murder in November 1991, but the wheels of justice ground forward slowly, and his trial would not begin for nearly 4 years. He would later claim, in one of the most disturbing statements attributed to him during the entire case, that his motive had been a twisted desire for infamy, to become what he called a superstar, comparing his ambitions to those of Ted Bundy, another serial killer whose name had become synonymous with American fear. In 1994, just as his trial was finally set to begin, Rowling made an unexpected decision that stunned the courtroom. He pleaded guilty to all charges, sparing the victims' families the ordeal of a lengthy trial but denying them, too, the chance to see every piece of evidence laid bare in open court. With his guilt established, the proceedings moved into the penalty phase, where prosecutor Rod Smith presented the case for the ultimate punishment. While awaiting trial, Rowling had confessed the details of his crimes to a fellow inmate, a convicted murderer and former death row escapee named Robert Fieldmore Lewis. whom he had befriended behind bars. Lewis later testified against Rowling, trading his cooperation for a transfer to a prison in Minnesota, a decision that added yet another layer of moral complexity to a case already saturated with darkness. On April 20th, 1994, the court sentenced Danny Rowling to death for each of the 5 Gainesville murders. Psychological evaluations conducted during the proceedings diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and paraphilia, clinical language attempting to capture something that ultimately defied full explanation. Forensic psychologist Dr. Harry Kropp, who had evaluated Rowling confidentially even before he was publicly identified as a suspect, would later describe the emotional weight of hearing Rowling's confession firsthand, and the disturbing process of trying to understand the roots of such violence without ever excusing it. For 12 more years, Danny Rowling sat on death row while appeals worked their way through the courts, his case periodically resurfacing in headlines as legal challenges rose and fell. Then, shortly before his scheduled execution in 2006, Rowling did something that finally closed the last open wound connected to his crimes. He handed his spiritual advisor, Reverend Mike Hudspeth, and Florida police a handwritten confession, at last formally admitting responsibility for the Shreveport murders of the Grissom family, the triple homicide that had gone unsolved for nearly 17 years. In total, across both states, Rowling ultimately confessed to 8 killings, a staggering toll of destroyed lives left behind by one man's descent into violence. On October 25, 2006, Danny Rowling was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison, after the United States Supreme Court rejected his final appeal. His last meal was lobster tail. In his final moments, he chose to sing a gospel hymn rather than speak any final statement, a strange, almost unsettling choice witnessed by many of the very relatives whose lives he had shattered years earlier. He was pronounced dead at 6:13 p.m. Eastern Time, bringing to a close a case that had terrorized a college town, claimed the lives of 5 young people with their entire futures ahead of them, and left an indelible mark on the collective memory of an entire generation of Floridians. The story of Danny Rowling did not end with his execution. Attorney Jack Fine, who represented 2 of the victims' families in the civil cases that followed, helped establish a lasting scholarship program in Gainesville to honor the memory of the 5 young people whose lives were cut short, a quiet, enduring tribute meant to ensure that Sonia Larson, Christina Powell, Krista Hoyt, Tracy Poles, and Manny Tabawada would be remembered not merely as victims of a notorious killer, but as students full of promise whose futures were stolen far too soon. What remains most haunting about this case is not simply the violence itself, but the questions it leaves unanswered. How does a childhood of relentless cruelty produce a man capable of such calculated horror, while countless others who endure similar suffering never harm another soul? Investigators, psychologists, and true crime observers have spent decades searching for that answer, and perhaps, in the end, there is no single explanation that fully satisfies the need to understand. What is certain is that for 4 terrifying days in August 1990, an ordinary college town became the site of unimaginable tragedy, and the memory of 5 bright young lives, taken far too soon, continues to remind an entire community of both the depths of human cruelty and the enduring strength required to carry on afterward. Story 6. The mid-north coast of New South Wales is a tapestry of ancient forests, sleepy rivers, and sun-drenched beaches, a stretch of Australian paradise where the emerald of the hinterland meets the sapphire of the Pacific. It's a place where communities are small and tightly knit, where life moves at a slower pace, dictated by the tides and the seasons. In this idyllic setting lies the village of Kendall, a quiet hamlet nestled beside the Camden Haven River, surrounded by the dense, brooding expanse of the Kendall State Forest. It is a town of weatherboard houses, neat gardens, and a single main street, a place where the loudest sounds are often the chatter of kookaburras and the distant rumble of a passing train. It is the kind of place where children are safe to play in their own backyards, where doors are often left unlocked, and where the worst thing that usually happens is a storm that knocks out the power for a few hours. In September 2014, Kendall was about to become the epicenter of a national tragedy, a place forever synonymous with a mystery that would capture and torment the heart of a nation. It was here that a 3-year-old boy with a radiant smile and an infectious giggle would step out of his grandmother's house and into a void, vanishing as completely as a wisp of morning mist over the river. His name was William Tyrrell, but he would become known to the world simply as the little boy in the Spider-Man suit. William's life had not begun in this quiet corner of the world. Born on June 26, 2011, his early years were marked by instability. His biological parents had a troubled history, and their struggles meant that William and his older sister were placed into the state's care, becoming wards of the Department of Family and Community Services. From the turmoil of his early life, he was delivered into the arms of a wealthy and loving foster family from Sydney's affluent North Shore. For legal reasons, their names would remain a closely guarded secret for years, a shield intended to protect the children in their care, but one that would later become a source of intense public debate and criticism. To William, they were simply Mum and Dad. They provided a life of stability and affection that he had never known. They were, by all accounts, devoted to him and his sister. Despite some behavioral challenges stemming from his early trauma, the family was moving towards formal adoption, ready to make their bond permanent. He was a happy, energetic child who loved to dance, draw, and ride his bike. He was obsessed with superheroes, especially Spider-Man. On the morning he disappeared, his foster mother had taken a photograph of him on the veranda, roaring like a tiger, a cheeky grin on his face, his small frame clad in his favorite red and blue costume. It would become the last image ever taken of him, a hauntingly vibrant picture that would be seared into the collective consciousness of Australia. On Thursday, September 11, 2014, the family made the 4-hour drive north from Sydney to visit William's foster grandmother in Kendall. Her house was on Benarun Drive, a quiet, dead-end street that backed directly onto the vast, untamed wilderness of the Kendall State Forest. It was a perfect place for children to play, with a large, sloping yard and endless opportunities for adventure. The next morning, Friday, September 12th, dawned bright and clear, a perfect spring day. William and his sister were playing in the yard, their laughter echoing in the quiet air. They played hide-and-seek, darting between the front and back of the house, while their foster mother and grandmother watched from outside. Around 10 a.m., the foster father left to run a business errand in the nearby town of Lakewood. Sometime between 10 o'clock and 10:25 a.m., as the two women sat enjoying the morning, William, in his Spider-Man suit, was playing near the side of the house. His foster mother heard him let out a ferocious roar, the sound of a little boy imitating a tiger, lost in his own world of imagination. It was the last sound she would ever hear him make. A few minutes later, she went inside to make a cup of tea. When she came back out, the yard was silent, eerily silent. A sudden, cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. 5 minutes had passed without a sound from William. She called his name. No answer. She began a frantic search of the house and yard, her calls growing more desperate with each passing moment. His sister, just 5 years old, didn't know where he was. The grandmother joined the search, their rising panic a stark contrast to the placid morning. Just then, William's foster father returned from his errand. He immediately began knocking on neighbors' doors, his voice urgent, his face a mask of growing fear. But no one had seen the little boy in the Spider-Man suit. It was as if he had simply been erased from the landscape. At 10:57 a.m., a little over half an hour after William was last seen, his foster mother made the call that no parent ever wants to make. She dialed 000, Australia's emergency number, her voice trembling as she reported her 3-year-old son missing. The New South Wales police force arrived at 11:06 a.m., and with their arrival, the quiet cul-de-sac of Benarun Drive was transformed into the chaotic heart of a massive search and rescue operation. The initial response was swift and immense. The local community, shaken by the news, rallied in a way that only small towns can. Hundreds of volunteers, friends, neighbors, and strangers fanned out across the area, their hearts heavy with a shared sense of dread. They were joined by police, the State Emergency Service, SES, and the Rural Fire Service. The search went on day and night. Motorcycles and helicopters scoured the terrain from the ground and the air, their engines a constant, anxious hum over the otherwise peaceful village. Divers plunged into the murky depths of nearby waterways and farm dams, searching for any sign of the missing boy. Every house in the estate was searched, not once, but several times. Specialist police, including the Sex Crimes Squad, were brought in. A special task force, Strike Force Rosan, was established, comprised of detectives experienced in the unexplained disappearances of children. They brought with them detection dogs, hoping the animals could pick up a scent. The dogs did find William's scent, but it was confined to the boundaries of his grandmother's backyard. The trail went cold at the edge of the property, offering no clue as to which direction he might have gone. After 5 grueling days of relentless searching, the police were forced to admit they had no leads. There was no sign of William. No scrap of his costume, no footprint, no trace at all. He was gone. The horrifying realization began to dawn on investigators. This was not a case of a child wandering off and getting lost in the bush. The sheer scale of the search, the lack of any physical evidence, and the speed with which he had vanished all pointed to a far more sinister conclusion. Within a few short hours of his disappearance, police were operating on the chilling theory that William Tyrrell had been abducted. The investigation pivoted from a search and rescue mission to a full-blown criminal investigation. Detectives began to scrutinize every detail of that morning, looking for anything out of the ordinary. And in a quiet street where everyone knew everyone, there had been something unusual. The foster mother recalled seeing 2 cars parked on the dead-end road that morning, a white station wagon and an older model gray sedan. They were parked between 2 driveways, their driver's side windows down. They were unfamiliar vehicles in a neighborhood where strangers were easily noticed. There was no logical reason for them to be there. After William vanished, they were gone too. These 2 mysterious cars became a major focus for the police, their presence on Benarun Drive that morning a deeply suspicious coincidence. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation broadened into one of the largest in NSW history. The case generated a record number of calls to Crime Stoppers, over 2,800 in the first few years alone. Police interviewed more than 1,000 people and identified 690 persons of interest. The search for William went global, with appeals for information posted on Crime Stoppers websites in 26 countries. Yet, despite the massive effort, the case grew colder with each passing day. For the first 7 years of the investigation, the prevailing theory remained that William was the victim of an opportunistic abduction, snatched by a stranger in the terrifyingly brief window of time when no one was watching. This theory led investigators down a dark and winding path into the disturbing world of child predators. Police looked into a suspected pedophile ring operating in the area, a group of men connected through an organization called Grandparents as Parents Again GAPA. 2 of these men, both convicted child offenders, were reported to have been driving vehicles matching the description of the 2 suspicious cars seen on Benarun Drive. They were questioned, but both denied any involvement. The investigation's focus on pedophiles led to one of the most controversial and damaging chapters in the case. A man named Bill Spedding, a local washing machine repairman who had been scheduled to do a repair at the foster grandmother's house on a different day, became a primary person of interest. He was subjected to intense public scrutiny and media attention. In a move that would later be deemed a gross miscarriage of justice, the lead detective at the time, Gary Jubilin, pursued Spedding relentlessly. Police arrested and charged Spedding with unrelated historical child sex offenses, a strategy later revealed to be a tactic to pressure him into confessing to William's disappearance. The charges were eventually dropped, and Spedding was completely cleared. He later sued the NSW police force and, in 2022, was awarded $1.5 million in damages for malicious prosecution. The court found that Gibellin's pursuit of him was malicious and an abuse of process. It was a stunning rebuke of the investigation's tactics and a dark stain on the search for justice for William. While the police were chasing down false leads and wrongly accusing innocent men, William's family was living in a state of suspended agony. A complex legal situation, stemming from William's status as a foster child, had silenced them. Under NSW law, his foster parents were prevented from being publicly identified or making direct appeals for information. This legal gag order became a point of major contention. The father of Daniel Morecombe, another young Australian boy who was abducted and murdered, publicly criticized the decision, arguing that the parents' voices were a vital tool in generating public information in the crucial early stages of a case. It wasn't until August 2017, nearly 3 years after William vanished, that the NSW Supreme Court of Appeal ruled that his status as a foster child was a matter of legitimate public interest, finally allowing the media to report the full circumstances of his life and his disappearance. As the years dragged on, hope of finding William alive began to fade, but the police and his family never gave up. On the second anniversary of his disappearance, in September 2016, the NSW government announced a $1 million reward for information leading to his recovery, the largest reward ever offered for a missing person in the state's history. The reward was unique in that it did not require the arrest and conviction of any person. It was for the recovery of William, a desperate plea for answers, for closure. But the answers remained elusive. The investigation, which had once been so focused on the theory of abduction by a stranger, was about to take a dramatic and shocking turn. In November 2021, 7 years after William disappeared, NSW police announced they had received new evidence that led them to believe William's disappearance was not an abduction at all. The entire focus of the investigation shifted back to where it all began, the house on Benarun Drive. Police descended on Kendall once again, but this time, their mission was different. They were no longer searching for a living boy. They were searching for a body. Detective Chief Superintendent Darren Bennett stated grimly, "It's highly likely that if we found something, it would be a body. We are looking for the remains of William Tyrrell, no doubt about that." For weeks, police conducted a massive, painstaking search of 3 areas around the property, including the garden of the house and a patch of nearby bushland. They used ground-penetrating radar, dug up the garden, and sifted through soil, looking for any trace of human remains. The nation watched, holding its breath, as the search unfolded on live television. Then came the bombshell. The police announced they were investigating a new theory, that William had not been abducted, but had died in a tragic accident at the property, a fall from a high balcony. And most shockingly of all, they named a new person of interest, William's foster mother. The woman who had made the frantic 911 call, who had lived for 7 years as the grieving mother of a stolen child, was now at the center of the investigation into his death. The police theory was that the foster mother had panicked after the accident and, in a desperate attempt to cover it up, had hidden William's body. The foster grandmother, who had since passed away, was also named as a person of interest. The news sent shockwaves through the Australian public. It was a twist so unthinkable, so contrary to the narrative that had been built over 7 years, that it was difficult to comprehend. The foster mother was subjected to intense questioning by the NSW Crime Commission. Police, convinced she was hiding the truth, told her bluntly, "We know how it happened, and we know why it happened, and we know where he is." They charged her with giving false or misleading information to the commission in an attempt to break her spirit and get her to reveal the location of William's body. Police even planted listening devices in her home and intercepted her phone calls, convinced she knew more than she was saying. Despite the renewed search and the intense pressure on the foster mother, no remains were found. The new theory, as dramatic as it was, had not brought the case any closer to a resolution. The mystery of William Tyrrell remained as deep and impenetrable as ever. In June 2023, the saga took yet another turn. The NSW police recommended that the Director of Public Prosecutions lay charges against the foster mother for perverting the course of justice and interfering with a corpse. They alleged she had concealed William's accidental death and disposed of his body. As of late 2025, the DPP has yet to make a final decision on whether to proceed with these charges. The foster mother has vehemently denied any wrongdoing, and her lawyers have demanded to see the evidence police claim to have against her. More than a decade has passed since the little boy in the Spider-Man suit vanished from his grandmother's yard. The case has become a national obsession, a story of heartbreak, bungled police work, and a mystery that refuses to be solved. It has exposed flaws in the justice system, raised difficult questions about the foster care system, and left a trail of ruined lives in its wake. Bill Spedding, the innocent man wrongly accused, had his life destroyed. The lead detective, Gary Jubilin, once hailed as a hero, had his career end in disgrace, convicted of illegally recording conversations during the investigation. William's biological and foster families remain trapped in a limbo of grief and uncertainty. And somewhere, the truth about what happened to William Tyrrell remains hidden. Did he wander into the unforgiving bushland and succumb to the elements? Was he snatched by an opportunistic predator who saw a small boy in a bright costume and saw a chance? Or did a tragic accident on a sunny spring day lead to a desperate, panicked cover-up? The house on Benaroon Drive still stands, a silent monument to the day a family's life was shattered. The Kendall State Forest still looms, its dense canopy holding its secrets close. For those who loved him, and for the nation that took him into its heart, William Tyrrell will forever be 3 years old, a little boy with a cheeky grin, roaring like a tiger in his Spider-Man suit on the last morning of his life. The question that has haunted a nation for over a decade remains unanswered. Where's William? Story 7. In the humid, sprawling city of Jacksonville, Florida, the summer of 1974 was thick with the scent of magnolias and the simmering tensions of a nation in flux. On Kings Road, a bustling artery that cut through the city's northwest side, the Grand Park food store was an anchor for the community, a place of familiar comfort in a rapidly changing world. Its owner, Fuad Freddie Farah, was the heart of the operation. At 34, he was a man in the prime of his life, a husband and the father of 4 young children, his days filled with the simple, satisfying rhythms of work and family. He was known for his kindness, a grocer who would let a child leave with a piece of candy, even if they were a few pennies short, a man whose easy smile was a constant in the lives of his customers. His life was a testament to the quiet promise of the American dream. He had built a business, a home, and a family, his world revolving around his wife, Nadia, and their 4 children, 3 daughters and a son, Bobby, who was just 6 years old. Their days were a tapestry of school runs, family dinners, and the shared work of running the store. Freddie was the provider, the protector, the steady center of their universe. On May 22nd, 1974, that universe was about to be shattered. It was a Wednesday, an ordinary afternoon at the Grand Park food store. The air was thick with the familiar smells of fresh produce and cleaning supplies. Freddie was behind the counter, the steady beep of the cash register a familiar soundtrack to his day. The store was quiet. A 14-year-old girl named Annette Bryant was at the counter, her purchase a simple domestic one: a can of soda, a box of cake mix, and a tub of frosting. Behind her stood a slender black teenager, no more than 17 years old, clutching a tool belt. He approached the counter, asking Freddie where to find the frosting. What happened next unfolded with the terrifying speed of a lightning strike. The teenager, his face a mask of nervous bravado, raised a gun over the young girl's head, the cold metal a shocking intrusion into the mundane afternoon. "This is a hold-up," he stammered, his voice betraying his youth. Freddie, his protective instincts kicking in, lunged for the weapon, his hand swatting at the gun in a desperate attempt to protect the young girl at the counter. In the chaos of that split-second decision, the gun went off. A single bullet struck Freddie in the head. He fell instantly. The teenager, startled and panicked, fled without taking a single dollar, leaving behind the items he had placed on the counter, his fingerprints a silent, invisible testament to his crime. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the small store, a sound that would reverberate through the lives of the Farah family for the next 4 decades. Freddie Farah, the kind-hearted grocer, the loving husband and father, was dead. The news of his murder sent a wave of shock and grief through the community. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office descended on the scene, their investigation beginning with the grim, methodical process of piecing together a tragedy. They had a witness, the terrified 14-year-old girl, who had been standing just inches from the muzzle of the gun. They had fingerprints, lifted from the cake mix and the soda the killer had left behind. But in 1974, fingerprint technology was a slow, manual process. The prints were run through the system, but there was no match. The killer was a ghost, a nameless, faceless teenager who had appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. For Nadia Farah, the world had ended. She was now a widow, a single mother to 4 children, the youngest just 5 years old. The life she had known, the future she had planned, was gone, stolen in a senseless act of violence that had yielded nothing but a lifetime of pain. In the depths of her grief, she found a reserve of strength she never knew she had. She went back to college, determined to build a new life for her children, to give them the future that their father had been denied. The Farah children grew up in the long, dark shadow of their father's murder. For the younger ones, their memories of him were fleeting, fractured images, more like dreams than reality. Bobby, his only son, was left with a gaping void where a father should have been. He grew up haunted by questions, his life a search for answers that no one could provide. Who had killed his father? And why? The case grew cold, the file gathering dust on a shelf in the cold case unit, one of thousands of unsolved tragedies that litter the landscape of American crime. The years turned into decades. The children grew up, had families of their own. Freddie was a grandfather to children he would never meet, his presence a ghost at every birthday party, every graduation, every holiday. The pain of his loss did not diminish with time. It simply changed shape, a constant, dull ache in the heart of the family he had left behind. 43 years is a lifetime. It is long enough for a teenager to become a grandfather, for a city to transform, for the world to change in 1,000 different ways. In the French Quarter of New Orleans, a man known as Uncle Louis had become a local institution. He was a street performer, a human statue who delighted tourists and locals alike with his painted face and his silent, stoic performances. He was known for his kindness to children, a gentle, eccentric figure in the vibrant, chaotic tapestry of the city. His real name was Johnny Louis Miller, and for 43 years he had carried a secret, a dark, heavy burden that had shaped the course of his entire life. He had fled Jacksonville after the murder, a scared 17-year-old boy who had found a gun in a vacant lot and, in a moment of desperate, misguided bravado, had decided to rob a store. The man he had killed was a man he knew, the friendly grocer who had always been kind to him. The memory of that day had haunted him, he would later say, driving him to spend the rest of his life trying to atone for his sin, trying to be nice to children to make up for the father he had stolen from the Farah family. Back in Jacksonville, the wheels of justice, though they had ground to a halt for decades, were beginning to turn again. In December 2016, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit, armed with new technology and a renewed determination, reopened the Freddie Farah case. The fingerprints, once a dead end, were now a key. They were entered into a new, vastly expanded national database, a digital web that could connect a crime in 1974 to a man living a different life in a different state. In April 2017, they got a hit. The prints from the soda can and the cake mix-matched a man named Johnny Louis Miller, a 60-year-old street performer living in New Orleans. The ghost of Kings Road finally had a name. On May 16, 2017, almost exactly 43 years after the murder, the New Orleans Police Department arrested Johnny Miller on a warrant for the murder of Freddie Farah. The news rippled through Jacksonville, a shockwave of disbelief and relief. For the Farah family, It was a moment they had never thought they would see. "We're relieved," Bobby Farah said at a press conference, his voice thick with the emotion of 4 decades of waiting. "Some of us never thought we'd see this day." The arrest was a testament to the dogged persistence of the cold case detectives, a reminder that no case is ever truly closed, no victim ever truly forgotten. Miller was extradited to Jacksonville to face justice. The state's case seemed strong. They had the fingerprints, and they had the witness, Annette Bryant Williams, the 14-year-old girl who had been at the counter that day. Now 58, she was prepared to testify, her memory of the terrified teenager who had held a gun over her head still vivid after all these years. But the path to justice is rarely straight. In a cruel twist of fate, just as the case was finally moving forward, it began to fall apart. In December 2017, Annette Bryant Williams, the only witness to the crime, passed away. Without her testimony, the state's case was significantly weakened. The fingerprints placed Miller at the scene, but they did not prove he had pulled the trigger. The prosecution, led by State Attorney Melissa Nelson, was faced with a difficult choice: drop the charges and let a killer walk free, or find another way. What happened next was extraordinary, a testament to the power of forgiveness and the human need for truth. Melissa Nelson's office proposed a radical solution, a form of restorative justice that is rarely seen in murder cases. They offered Johnny Miller a deal. Admit what you did, answer the questions that have haunted the Farah family for 44 years, and you can walk free. For the Farah family, it was a stunning proposition. They could have demanded vengeance, insisted on a trial that might have ended in a life sentence. But what they wanted more than punishment was answers. They wanted to know why. They wanted to look the man who had stolen their father in the eye and hear the truth from his own lips. They agreed to the meeting. On April 20th, 2018, in a conference room at the prosecutor's office, 2 families, bound together by a single, violent moment 4 decades earlier, came face to face. Johnny Miller, his ankles shackled, his head hung in shame, was led into the room. Bobby Farah, now a man in his 50s, the same age his father had been when he died, sat across from him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a bullet, sliding it across the table toward Miller. "This small piece of metal," he said, his voice trembling, "changed the whole course of our lives." And then, for the next hour, the questions poured out, a torrent of pain and confusion that had been dammed up for 44 years. Miller, his voice choked with emotion, told them everything. He told them about growing up poor in the Jim Crow South, about finding the gun, about the foolish, desperate decision to rob the store. He told them he had never intended to kill anyone, that he had panicked when Freddie lunged for the gun. He told them that Freddie was a good man, a man who had always been kind to him. He apologized over and over again, his remorse a palpable presence in the room. "If he didn't tell me he was sorry 50 times, Bobby Farah would later say, he probably said it 100 times. In that room, something shifted. The anger and the hatred that had been the Farah family's constant companions for so long began to dissolve, replaced by something that looked like understanding, something that felt like peace. They saw in Johnny Miller not a monster, but a scared kid who had made a terrible mistake and had lived with the consequences every day of his life. A few days later, in a Jacksonville courtroom, the final act of this long, strange tragedy played out. Johnny Miller pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of second-degree murder. With the blessing of the Farah family, he was sentenced to time served, the 344 days he had spent in jail awaiting trial. And then, in a moment that was both surreal and profoundly moving, he walked out of the courthouse a free man. As he left, he turned to the tearful Farah family and mouthed the words, "Thank you." Bobby Farah, in a gesture of unimaginable grace, flashed him a thumbs up. The decision was met with a mixture of awe and bewilderment. How could a family forgive the man who had caused them so much pain? For Bobby Farah, the answer was simple. The truth, the answers he had been searching for his whole life, was more valuable than vengeance. "Am I upset that he is not spending time?" he asked. "I'd rather him answer my questions and give me the answers that I have been looking for all my life than to have him sitting in jail without anything." The story of Freddie Farah and Johnny Miller is a story that defies easy categorization. It is a story of a senseless crime and a 44-year search for justice. It is a story of the power of technology to reach back in time and pluck a secret from the past. But most of all, it is a story about the radical, transformative power of forgiveness. It is a story that reminds us that justice does not always look like punishment, that closure does not always come from a prison cell. Sometimes it comes from a quiet room, from a heartfelt apology, from the simple, human act of looking a man in the eye and choosing to see not a monster, but a man. The ghost of King's Road, the specter of a crime that had haunted a family for 2 generations, had finally been laid to rest, not by a verdict, but by an act of grace. Story 8. The city of Baltimore in the spring of 2006 was a place of stark contrasts. A city of historic brick facades and gleaming modern towers, of old money and new ambition. For Ray and Allison Rivera, it had become home. They had arrived from Los Angeles 18 months prior, a young couple full of optimism, drawn east by a job offer for Ray. They had been married for just 6 months, their life a canvas of fresh beginnings. They bought a house in the Northwood neighborhood, a cozy brick home for $280,000, a place to build their future. Ray, a 32-year-old aspiring filmmaker and writer, was a man of boundless energy and charisma. At 6 feet 5 inches, he was a gentle giant, someone whose physical presence was matched only by the warmth of his personality. Friends and family knew him as steadfast, loving, and utterly devoted to Allison. He had worked as a water polo coach in California, where his players would sprint to the side of the pool during timeouts, captivated by his guidance. He was a man people were drawn to, a natural leader with a creative soul. Now he was channeling that creativity into a new venture, writing financial newsletters for Stansberry and Associates, a publishing company owned by his old friend, Porter Stansberry. He also had his own projects, working on screenplays and planning to start a production company, with dreams of moving back to Los Angeles with Allison to pitch his work. Life was a whirlwind of plans and possibilities. In mid-May, that whirlwind swept Allison away on a business trip to New York. On the evening of May 16, 2006, she called home, expecting to hear her husband's familiar, comforting voice. But Ray didn't answer. She wasn't immediately alarmed. He was likely engrossed in his writing. She tried again, and then again. Silence. A knot of unease began to tighten in her stomach. At 9:30 p.m., she called Claudia, a colleague who was staying as a guest in their home while Allison was away. Claudia's words would be the last account of Ray's conscious movements ever recorded. She told Allison that around 6:30 p.m., the house phone had rung. Ray answered. Claudia, in another room, heard him utter a single surprised word. "Oh." Then she heard the sound of his footsteps, quick and urgent. He had rushed out of the house, leaving in such a hurry that he took almost nothing with him. Just his keys, his cell phone, and the clothes on his back. As the night wore on, Allison's unease grew into a cold dread. At 5 a.m. the next morning, Claudia called again. Ray had not come home. This was not like him. He was not a man who disappeared. He was a man who came home. Allison knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that something was terribly wrong. She immediately left New York and began the frantic drive back to Baltimore, her mind racing through 1,000 terrible scenarios, each more unthinkable than the last. She called hospitals. She called the police. She called every friend and family member they had, her voice trembling with a rising panic. When she arrived home, the house felt unnaturally still, the silence echoing with Ray's absence. She filed a missing person report, the formal words on the page a stark, bureaucratic confirmation of her living nightmare. The days that followed blurred into a haze of fear and desperation. Family and friends flew in from across the country, a small army of hope descending on Baltimore to find Ray. They plastered the city with missing person flyers bearing his smiling face. They walked the streets, checked homeless shelters, and revisited every place he was known to frequent. They were searching for a man who was impossible to miss, tall, handsome, and vivacious, yet he had vanished from the face of the earth without a single witness. The search turned up nothing. Not a single credible sighting. Not a whisper of his whereabouts. It was as if the bustling city had swallowed him whole. Allison's life became a suspended state of waiting, each ringing phone a potential answer, each knock on the door a possible end to the torment. But the calls were only well-wishers, and the knocks were only friends bringing food she couldn't eat. For 6 agonizing days there was nothing. The police had no leads. Ray's credit cards were unused. His bank accounts were untouched. The hope that had fueled the initial search began to curdle into a grim resignation. The question was no longer just where was Ray, but what had happened to him. Then a breakthrough. On May 22nd, 6 days after he disappeared, Ray's black Isuzu Rodeo was found. It was parked in a lot near the historic Belvedere Hotel in Baltimore's Mount Vernon neighborhood, a grand, aging building that had once been the city's tallest and had hosted presidents and celebrities in its heyday. A parking ticket on the windshield showed the car had been there since the evening of May 16th, the day he vanished. The discovery of the car was a jolt, a solid piece of a puzzle that had been nothing but empty space. But it was a confusing piece. What was Ray doing at the Belvedere? He knew people who worked there and had visited its bars before, but why would he have rushed there that night? The discovery of the car focused the search on the hotel and its surroundings. The family's hope, which had been flickering, flared anew. He had to be somewhere nearby. On May 24th, 2006, 8 days after Ray Rivera ran out of his house, 3 of his co-workers from Stansberry and Associates decided to conduct their own search. They focused on the parking garage adjacent to the Belvedere, the one where Ray's car had been found. From the top level of the garage, they could look down onto the roofs of the hotel's various annexes. It was a long shot, a desperate scan of a cityscape that had so far offered no clues. From their vantage point, they looked down upon the roof of a lower annex, a conference center on the hotel's 2nd floor. And then they saw it, a sight so strange, so out of place, that it stopped them cold. Lying on the gravelly surface of the roof were a pair of flip-flops, a cell phone, and a pair of eyeglasses. Next to the items, a dark, jagged hole, about 3 feet in diameter, gaped in the roof's surface. A terrible, sickening dread washed over them. They called the police. The hotel's concierge, Gary Shivers, was summoned to unlock the room beneath the hole. It was a small conference room, an annex space that had been abandoned for years, gathering dust and forgotten memories. When Shivers opened the door, the search for Ray Rivera came to its horrific end. His body lay on the floor, severely decomposed, confirming that he had been there for a long time, likely since the night he disappeared. Above him, the afternoon light streamed through the ragged hole in the ceiling, a spotlight on the tragic final scene of his life. Allison and Ray's family were summoned, their last, desperate hopes for a safe return shattered by a reality more brutal than they could have imagined. The initial police theory formed almost instantly. To the first officers on the scene, the narrative seemed obvious. A man's body, a hole in the roof above him, personal effects on the roof nearby. The Belvedere was a tall building with a history of suicides. The conclusion was swift. Ray Rivera, for reasons unknown, had jumped from the main roof of the 14-story hotel, plunging through the lower annex roof to his death. The Baltimore Police Department quickly began to classify the death as a probable suicide. But for those who knew Ray, and for the few investigators who looked closer, this simple explanation was anything but. It was the beginning of a deeper, more disturbing mystery. Homicide detective Mike Bayer was one of the first on the scene. As he looked at the pristine glasses, the neatly placed flip-flops, and the still-working cell phone on the annex roof, his gut screamed that something was wrong. After an 11-story fall, how could these items be virtually unscathed? It looked less like the aftermath of a desperate leap and more like a carefully arranged tableau. The scene, he felt, was staged. The official narrative of suicide began to unravel almost as soon as it was formed. The first and most glaring contradiction was Ray himself. His family and friends were adamant. Ray would not have taken his own life. He had no history of depression or mental illness. He was a newlywed, deeply in love, making ambitious plans for the future. Most pointedly, Ray Rivera was terrified of heights. The idea that he would willingly go to the roof of a tall building, let alone jump from it, was inconceivable to them. Then there were the physical impossibilities of the scene itself. The hole in the annex roof was located a significant horizontal distance from the main hotel tower. For Ray to have landed there, he couldn't have just stepped off the edge. An engineering study later commissioned for the investigation calculated that he would have needed to get a running start of at least 11 miles per hour to cover the horizontal distance of approximately 45 feet. The main roof was a cluttered, difficult space, not a running track. How could a man in flip-flops achieve that speed and execute such a jump? For context, the world record for the long jump, set by an Olympic athlete in proper footwear, is just over 29 feet. Furthermore, no one saw Ray at the hotel that night. Not the staff, not the residents, not the patrons in the bars and restaurants, some of whom knew him personally. He was a 6'5" man who would have been hard to miss. Yet, he seemingly slipped through the historic hotel like a ghost. The building's security cameras offered no help. None of the recordings showed him inside or outside the building. Most suspiciously, the camera pointed at the roof access staircase, which had been working the day before and the day after his disappearance, was found to have been disconnected on the night of May 16th. The discovery of the car focused the search on the hotel and its surroundings. The family's hope, which had been flickering, flared anew. He had to be somewhere nearby. On May 24th, 2006, 8 days after Ray Rivera ran out of his house, 3 of his co-workers from Stansberry and Associates decided to conduct their own search. They focused on the parking garage adjacent to the Belvedere, the one where Ray's car had been found. From the top level of the garage, they could look down onto the roofs of the hotel's various annexes. It was a long shot, a desperate scan of a cityscape that had so far offered no clues. From their vantage point, they looked down upon the roof of a lower annex, a conference center on the hotel's second floor. And then they saw it, a sight so strange, so out of place, that it stopped them cold. Lying on the gravelly surface of the roof were a pair of flip-flops, a cell phone, and a pair of eyeglasses. Next to the items, a dark, jagged hole, about 3 feet in diameter, gaped in the roof's surface. A terrible, sickening dread washed over them. They called the police. The hotel's concierge, Gary Shivers, was summoned to unlock the room beneath the hole. It was a small conference room, an annex space that had been abandoned for years, gathering dust and forgotten memories. When Shivers opened the door, the search for Ray Rivera came to its horrific end. His body lay on the floor, severely decomposed, confirming that he had been there for a long time, likely since the night he disappeared. Above him, the afternoon light streamed through the ragged hole in the ceiling, a spotlight on the tragic final scene of his life. Allison and Ray's family were summoned, their last, desperate hopes for a safe return shattered by a reality more brutal than they could have imagined. The initial police theory formed almost instantly. To the first officers on the scene, the narrative seemed obvious. A man's body, a hole in the roof above him, personal effects on the roof nearby. The Belvedere was a tall building with a history of suicides. The conclusion was swift. Ray Rivera, for reasons unknown, had jumped from the main roof of the 14-story hotel, plunging through the lower annex roof to his death. The Baltimore Police Department quickly began to classify the death as a probable suicide. But for those who knew Ray, and for the few investigators who looked closer, this simple explanation was anything but. It was the beginning of a deeper, more disturbing mystery. Homicide detective Mike Bayer was one of the first on the scene. As he looked at the pristine glasses, the neatly placed flip-flops, and the still-working cell phone on the annex roof, his gut screamed that something was wrong. After an 11-story fall, how could these items be virtually unscathed? It looked less like the aftermath of a desperate leap, and more like a carefully arranged tableau. The scene, he felt, was staged. The official narrative of suicide began to unravel almost as soon as it was formed. The first and most glaring contradiction was Ray himself. His family and friends were adamant. Ray would not have taken his own life. He had no history of depression or mental illness. He was a newlywed, deeply in love, making ambitious plans for the future. Most pointedly, Ray Rivera was terrified of heights. The idea that he would willingly go to the roof of a tall building, let alone jump from it, was inconceivable to them. Then there were the physical impossibilities of the scene itself. The hole in the annex roof was located a significant horizontal distance from the main hotel tower. For Ray to have landed there, he couldn't have just stepped off the edge. An engineering study later commissioned for the investigation calculated that he would have needed to get a running start of at least 11 miles per hour to cover the horizontal distance of approximately 45 feet. The main roof was a cluttered, difficult space, not a running track. How could a man in flip-flops achieve that speed and execute such a jump? For context, the world record for the long jump, set by an Olympic athlete in proper footwear, is just over 29 feet. Furthermore, no one saw Ray at the hotel that night. Not the staff, not the residents, not the patrons in the bars and restaurants, some of whom knew him personally. He was a 6'5" man who would have been hard to miss. Yet, he seemingly slipped through the historic hotel like a ghost. The building's security cameras offered no help. None of the recordings showed him inside or outside the building. Most suspiciously, the camera pointed at the roof access staircase, which had been working the day before and the day after his disappearance, was found to have been disconnected on the night of May 16th. This refusal to cooperate cast a dark shadow of suspicion over the company. Stansberry and Associates was a financial firm that produced high-priced investment newsletters, some costing subscribers over $1,000. The business was controversial. In the past, the company had been cited by the Securities and Exchange Commission for producing false financial leads. Was Ray, a man of strong principles, involved in something that had gone wrong? Had he discovered some wrongdoing? Was the call a lure, a summons to a meeting that would prove fatal? The company's silence was deafening, leaving these questions to fester. In the absence of clear answers, theories multiplied, each attempting to connect the disparate and confusing dots of the case. The police and the FBI held to the suicide theory, propped up by the analysis of the note as a product of a psychotic episode. In this scenario, Ray suffered a sudden break from reality, rushed to a familiar landmark, and in a delusional state, took a leap that seemed physically impossible. His fear of heights would have been irrelevant, and the bizarre state of the evidence could be attributed to the unpredictable nature of such a tragic event. The murder theory, favored by his family and many independent investigators, branched into several possibilities. One theory proposed that Ray was killed elsewhere, perhaps beaten or hit by a car as the forensic experts suggested, and his body was then transported to the Belvedere. The scene on the annex roof, the hole, the phone, the glasses, was then elaborately staged to simulate a suicide jump. The hole could have been cut, and his body placed inside the room from the ground floor. This would explain the undamaged belongings, the lack of witnesses, and the impossible physics of the fall. But it raised its own questions. Why go to such elaborate lengths? Another version of the murder theory suggested he was confronted at the hotel, possibly in a room or on the roof itself, and then thrown. This, however, ran up against the problem of the jump's trajectory. To account for the horizontal distance, some have even floated the macabre theory that he was dropped from a helicopter, a hypothesis that would explain the location of the impact, but seems like something from a spy thriller, not a real-life crime in Baltimore. The motive for murder almost always led back to his work. Did a disgruntled client who lost money based on a newsletter Ray wrote come after him? Or did Ray uncover a serious financial crime within the company and was silenced before he could expose it? The company's gag order only fueled this speculation, making it the most plausible, yet unprovable, line of inquiry. His wife, Allison, wondered if his death was connected to his work writing the Rebound Report, which provided financial advice to subscribers. Years have passed since Ray Rivera's body was found in that dusty, abandoned room. The case remains officially open with the Baltimore Police Department, but it is cold. The questions that haunted his family in 2006 remain unanswered today. Who made the phone call that sent him running into the night? What is the true meaning of the strange note he left behind? How did he travel 45 horizontal feet in a pair of flip-flops to crash through a roof no one could believe he could reach? And why were his glasses and phone found sitting nearby, almost perfectly preserved? Alison Rivera still holds out hope that someone will come forward with the missing piece of the puzzle that will bring clarity and justice for Ray. His story, amplified by an episode of the television series Unsolved Mysteries, has captured the public's imagination, a haunting modern mystery that defies easy explanation. It is the story of a vibrant life cut short, of a love shattered by an inexplicable tragedy, and of a death shrouded in a fog of contradictions and secrets. The Belvedere Hotel still stands in Mount Vernon, its grand facade a silent witness to the mystery that began within its orbit, a mystery that started with a sudden phone call and ended with an impossible fall.